In 1995, a young photographer vanished without a trace after a small-town festival. Now, 13 years later, his last roll of film is discovered inside an abandoned storage locker, and the haunting images it contains expose a hidden truth that someone has tried to keep buried for over a decade. The summer of 1995 had left the little town buzzing with color, music, and laughter as the annual Arts and Crafts Festival filled the streets. Among the crowd, weaving through the booths with practiced ease, was 28-year-old photographer Daniel Cross. He carried his camera like an extension of himself, snapping candid portraits of vendors arranging their handmade goods, children with faces painted like tigers, and couples holding hands beneath strings of paper lanterns. He was known in town for his warmth and the way his smile seemed to put strangers instantly at ease. But there was also something sharper in his gaze that day, as though he was looking for more than just moments of beauty. Friends recalled him lingering longer than usual, his lens focusing not only on the festivities but on the edges of the crowd. He seemed captivated by certain faces, unfamiliar men who drifted in and out of the festival like they didn't belong. That evening, Daniel promised his sister Emily he would bring her prints from the weekend. It was the last promise he ever made. By dawn the next morning, Daniel was gone. His apartment door was locked, his bed untouched, and his bag of spare lenses and film left neatly on the desk. His camera was missing, along with the roll of film he had been shooting that night. At first, friends thought he had gone on a trip, maybe chasing a new story, but when days stretched into weeks, concern hardened into dread. The search that followed covered every trail in and around the festival grounds. Police combed through the woods, questioned attendees, and circulated his photo in neighboring towns. Nothing turned up. It was as if Daniel had stepped off the crowded street into thin air. Emily clung to hope, keeping his photographs on display in her home, reminders of a brother who had always found beauty even in the overlooked corners of life. But the case went cold, drifting into silence as years passed. It wasn't until 2008, inside a dust-choked storage locker in another state, that the first real clue surfaced. Among boxes of forgotten belongings sat a film canister, its label scrawled with Daniel's unmistakable handwriting. Inside was the last roll he had ever shot, the one he never had the chance to develop. The storage locker had been abandoned for years, its rent unpaid, and its contents left to gather dust behind a rusted sliding door. When it was finally auctioned off, the winning bidder expected nothing more than scrap furniture and old magazines. What they found instead was a cardboard box filled with personal effects, some of them carefully wrapped in newspaper dated from the mid-90s. Inside the box, tucked between a stack of yellowed flyers and a cracked leather notebook, lay a small black film canister. The label was faded but legible, the initials D.C. written in quick, familiar strokes. The buyer thought little of it until they uncovered the newspaper clippings folded neatly beneath. Each one bore Daniel Cross's name, his disappearance from 1995 chronicled in black ink. Alarmed by the connection, the buyer contacted the authorities, who quickly traced the case back to Emily. When Emily received the call, she felt the world shift beneath her feet. For 13 years there had been nothing but silence, no new evidence, no trace of her brother. Now suddenly, his handwriting had surfaced, carried forward by time in a forgotten locker hundreds of miles from where he vanished. She drove to meet the detectives, her heart pounding with the weight of both dread and hope. At the sheriff's office, she was handed the canister sealed in a clear evidence bag. She pressed her fingers against the plastic as tears blurred her vision. It was undeniably his script. She had seen it on countless letters, on the notes he left her when she visited his apartment, even on the birthday cards he sent. To touch it again after all these years felt like standing in his presence, fragile and fleeting. The detectives explained that the film would need to be developed carefully due to its age. The emulsion might have degraded, leaving little more than shadows, but there was still a chance. Emily nodded, unable to speak, clutching the bag as if it were a lifeline. That night she sat alone in her car outside the station, staring at the canister in her lap. For 13 years, she had imagined every possibility of what had happened to Daniel. Now, at last, she felt closer to an answer. Whatever images the film revealed, they would be his final message, a glimpse into the mystery that had stolen him away. The film was sent to a specialized forensic photo lab, one of the few places capable of handling rolls that had sat undeveloped for over a decade. Emily accompanied the detectives as they delivered it, her hands twisting restlessly in her lap during the drive. She had spent the night imagining what the negatives might hold. Part of her feared it would be nothing but streaks and faded light, 13 years of decay erasing any hope of clarity. Another part feared the opposite, that the images might finally show her what had happened to Daniel and that the truth would be more devastating than the mystery. The lab was a quiet, sterile place, the hum of machines filling the silence. A technician in a white coat received the canister with careful hands, assuring them the process would take hours. Emily lingered in the waiting room, pacing between the rows of plastic chairs. Every tick of the clock seemed to press against her chest. She remembered how Daniel used to return from his assignments, carrying rolls of film in his jacket pockets, grinning as if each one contained a secret only he could reveal. He had always said photographs were pieces of time you could hold, proof that life happened even when memory failed. When the technician finally emerged, he carried a folder of contact sheets. Emily's breath caught as he laid them on the table. The images were faint in places, but they were there. The first frames were ordinary festival scenes, children laughing with balloons, vendors setting out their wares, strings of lanterns glowing at dusk. But as the roll advanced, the mood shifted. Darker shots appeared, taken later in the night, the crowd thinning. In several frames, a figure lingered at the edges, half hidden in the blur of movement. The man wore a wide-brimmed hat, pulled low over his face, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed not on the festival, but on Daniel's camera. Emily's hand trembled as she traced the outline of the figure on the contact sheet. He appeared again and again in different parts of the festival, always distant, always watching. Daniel hadn't just been capturing the joy of the night, he had been documenting something else, something that frightened him enough to keep shooting until the very end. Emily studied the contact sheets under the sterile light of the lab, her heart aching at the realization that these were Daniel's final frames. She leaned closer, following the progression of the shots as if retracing his footsteps through that night. The wide-brimmed hat appeared in the background of one photograph near a food stall, then again by the music stage, and finally in a dim alley between two brick buildings where the festival lights no longer reached. Each time, the man's face was obscured, but his presence was unmistakable. One photograph stood apart from the others. It was underexposed, almost swallowed by shadow, but when the technician adjusted the contrast on the screen, the outline of Daniel's reflection appeared faintly in a glass storefront. Behind him, the man in the hat stood closer than before, his posture rigid, almost confrontational. The discovery made Emily's skin prickle. Daniel had not only noticed the figure, he had turned his camera deliberately to capture the evidence. The detectives exchanged uneasy glances. They knew this was more than coincidence. Someone had been following Daniel that night, and his instincts as a photographer had compelled him to document it. What remained unanswered was why, and how that roll of film had ended up locked away in a storage unit hundreds of miles from the festival grounds. Emily pressed her fingers against the table, trying to steady herself. She remembered conversations with her brother in the weeks before he vanished, the way he brushed off questions about his latest project. "You'll see it when it's ready," he had told her, with a half-smile. Now she wondered if he had uncovered something dangerous, something that drew the wrong kind of attention. The technician carefully slid the negatives back into protective sleeves, promising high-resolution scans for further analysis. Emily asked to hold one of the prints. As she studied the faint image of Daniel's reflection and the looming figure behind him, she felt both grief and determination rising together. For 13 years she had lived with silence, but the film had broken it. Daniel had left her a trail, even if he hadn't lived to explain it. And somewhere, in the blurred edges of those photographs, the answer to his disappearance waited to be found. Emily left the lab with the folder of contact sheets pressed tightly against her chest, as though the thin paper carried the weight of her brother's voice. The drive back to her motel felt longer than it was, her mind replaying the sequence of images until the blurred figure in the hat seemed etched into her vision. She barely noticed the neon vacancy sign flickering outside as she parked, or the hollow thud of the motel door closing behind her. She spread the photographs across the small desk, arranging them in order the way Daniel would have, trying to piece together his path. The earlier shots brimmed with life, the colors of streamers, the glow of lanterns, faces caught mid-laughter. Then came the shadows. The man with the hat appeared, subtle at first, as if testing the edges of Daniel's awareness. Each frame drew him closer, until finally he stood almost behind Daniel in the glass reflection. Emily's breath hitched every time her eyes lingered on that frame. She imagined her brother realizing he was being followed, yet choosing to keep his camera raised. It was so like him, refusing to look away, always chasing the story even when it frightened him. She wondered if he knew that night would be his last, or if he believed even then that he could capture the truth and walk away unscathed. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. It was Detective Harris, who had been working the case since the film surfaced. He stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the photographs. "He knew he was being watched," Harris said quietly. Emily nodded, her throat too tight for words. Harris leaned over the desk, pointing to the frame with the storefront reflection. "This isn't random. Whoever that is, Daniel wanted us to see him." Emily asked the question that had been haunting her since the film was found. Why would the roll end up in a storage locker so far from town? Harris shook his head. People don't abandon evidence like this unless they're hiding something bigger. Whoever took Daniel didn't destroy the film. They hid it. Maybe they thought it was safer that way. As Emily stared down at the grainy images, her resolve hardened. If Daniel had risked everything to leave her this trail, she would follow it. And this time, she would not let him vanish into silence. Detective Harris arranged for the photographs to be digitized and enhanced, hoping the blurred edges might sharpen enough to identify the man in the hat. Emily sat beside him in the dim glow of a monitor as the technician adjusted contrast and brightness, each click of the mouse revealing details that had long been hidden in shadows. The grain cleared just enough to show a tall figure, lean and stiff, his jawline partly visible beneath the brim. He wore a dark coat that seemed out of place for a warm summer night. Emily leaned closer, her pulse quickening. "He wasn't just following," she whispered. "He was posing." It was true, his body angled toward the lens in several frames, not simply caught by accident. He seemed aware of Daniel's camera, as though daring him to keep shooting. Harris made notes, his tone measured. "This isn't someone avoiding attention, this is someone leaving a mark." Emily's mind flashed back to her brother's final conversations, the way he spoke of a project too important to abandon. She had assumed it was another magazine feature, maybe something artistic. But now she wondered if Daniel had stumbled onto something far larger, something that made men like the one in the photographs want to be seen and yet remain nameless. The technician printed enlargements of the most revealing frames and handed them across the table. Harris slid them into protective sleeves, already considering who might still remember the festival crowd from that year. He promised to cross-check the images with old security records, though both he and Emily knew how unlikely it was for someone's face to be on file after all this time. That night, back in her motel room, Emily pinned the enlargements against the wall in sequence. The more she stared at them, the more it felt like a silent conversation between her brother and the stranger. Daniel's lens had not flinched. He had kept shooting, frame after frame, as if he wanted to make sure someone would understand later. Emily touched the final photograph where Daniel's faint reflection appeared in the glass, the shadow of the hat looming behind him. "You were trying to tell me," she murmured. For the first time in years, she felt as if Daniel was speaking to her again, guiding her toward a truth he had died to preserve. Emily returned to her childhood home the following weekend, carrying the folder of photographs as if it were a sacred relic. The house still smelled faintly of cedar and old books, a place where Daniel's presence lingered in every corner. Their mother had passed some years ago, but the walls remained lined with Daniel's framed prints, his eye for beauty immortalized in frozen slices of time. Emily laid the new contact sheets on the dining table beneath the soft glow of the chandelier, surrounding herself with both his older work and his final shots. She remembered how Daniel used to sit in that very chair, bent over his enlarger, carefully guiding the paper through trays of developer and fixer in the makeshift darkroom he had built in the basement. He had been meticulous, always patient with the process, believing that photographs carried more weight when they revealed what others had overlooked. That belief seemed to pulse through the images now spread before her. As she studied them, her eyes caught something she had missed before. In one frame, where the festival lantern swung gently above a crowded street, the man in the hat stood beside a sign tacked to a wooden post. The image was blurry, but Emily thought she could make out faint markings on the post. She enlarged it with a magnifying glass and saw what looked like a carved symbol, something crude, like overlapping triangles. Her breath hitched. She had seen that mark before. Years earlier, she had noticed it scratched into the doorframe of Daniel's studio, a symbol she thought was just graffiti. Now here it was again, hidden in plain sight in one of his last photographs. When she called Harris to tell him, his tone grew sharper. He promised to look into whether the mark had ties to local groups in the mid-90s. Emily felt her pulse quicken with both fear and resolve. Daniel had not been photographing random faces or chance encounters. He had been tracing a pattern, one marked by signs she had only now begun to recognize. As evening shadows filled the house, Emily looked around at her brother's old prints. For the first time, she realized Daniel had been leaving her clues long before the film was ever found. And somewhere between the symbols and the shadows, he was still speaking to her. Emily could not shake the image of the carved symbol, its rough lines etched into the post behind the man in the hat. It gnawed at her, a sign of something deliberate, something Daniel had noticed and tried to record. She returned to the basement darkroom where Daniel had once spent countless nights. The space had been untouched since his disappearance, a shrine of dust-covered trays, curling photo paper, and boxes of negatives stacked neatly in labeled envelopes. The air was heavy, with the faint metallic tang of old chemicals. She switched on the dim red bulb Daniel used to favor, its glow casting shadows across the room. She ran her fingers along the edges of the boxes until she found one marked simply, "Festival Work." Inside were dozens of contact sheets from years before 1995, candid images of parades, small-town gatherings, and craft fairs. As she flipped through them, her breath caught. The symbol was there too, scratched into the back wall of a bandstand in a photograph from 1993, painted faintly on a fence in another image from 1994. Always subtle, always in the background, and always unnoticed until now. Emily spread the sheets across the workbench, the pattern beginning to form in her mind. Daniel had been documenting these symbols long before the summer he disappeared. He hadn't told her, perhaps to protect her, but the repetition was too precise to be accidental. She carried the sheets upstairs and called Harris, her voice trembling with urgency. When he arrived, she laid out the images across the table, pointing to each symbol. Harris studied them in silence, his jaw tightening. "This isn't random graffiti," he finally said. "It's a marker. These kinds of signs usually mean territory, warnings, or directions. And if Daniel was photographing them, he may have known exactly what they meant." Emily's heart pounded as she realized her brother had not just been an observer at that festival. He had been following a trail, piecing together something dangerous. The man in the hat was not just a shadow at the edge of his lens, he was guarding whatever those symbols represented. For the first time, Emily felt she was stepping into the same path Daniel had walked, one marked with signs left in plain sight, daring anyone brave enough to follow. Harris took the photographs back to the station for further analysis, but Emily remained restless. She couldn't sit idle while her brother's clues stared back at her. That night she drove to the old festival grounds, a stretch of open field now used only for the occasional flea market. The summer air was heavy with the scent of cut grass, and the wooden posts that had once held lanterns still stood weathered and gray at the edges of the property. With a flashlight in hand, Emily moved slowly along the posts, her beam sweeping across the rough wood. Halfway down the row, her light caught on something carved deep into the grain. Her heart lurched. The overlapping triangles were still there, nearly worn away by time but visible enough to match the mark in Daniel's photograph. She traced the grooves with her fingertips, the edges rough beneath her skin, and felt a chill knowing her brother had once stood in the same spot, raising his camera to capture it. A sudden rustle in the grass behind her made her whirl around, her flashlight cutting across the empty field. Nothing moved, but the silence afterward felt heavier than before. She told herself it was just the wind, yet her hands trembled as she lowered the light. The next morning she returned to the site with Harris. He crouched beside the carving, photographing it carefully, his expression unreadable. "This wasn't random vandalism," he said. "It was put here as a signal. People who use markings like this don't expect outsiders to notice." Daniel must have started connecting them, and someone realized it. Emily watched the detective's face, looking for any hint of hesitation, but he only seemed more resolved. If Daniel followed these signs, he may have discovered something at that festival he wasn't meant to see. That explains the man in the hat. They stood in silence as the morning sun rose over the field, washing the old posts in pale light. Emily felt as though the ground beneath her held secrets, echoes of her brother's final steps. For 13 years the place had looked ordinary, just a field where music and laughter once rang out. But now she understood what Daniel had seen. It had been marked all along. Emily sat at her kitchen table that evening, the photographs spread before her once more, but this time her attention drifted to Daniel's old notebooks stacked in a shoebox nearby. She had kept them for years, unable to part with his handwriting, the hurried scrawls of ideas and sketches that filled the margins. Most of the entries were mundane lists, appointments, places he wanted to visit, quotes that had caught his ear, but as she flipped through a battered journal from 1995, a series of notes caught her eye. The handwriting grew tighter, more hurried. Phrases like symbols repeating, different towns, and watching me filled the page. Next to them, Daniel had drawn crude sketches of the overlapping triangles, circled and underlined. Emily's chest tightened as she read one line written in darker ink, the pen pressed hard enough to indent the paper beneath. "If anything happens, the film will tell the story." Her hands trembled as she traced the words. It was as if Daniel had been speaking directly to her across 13 years of silence, leaving behind a warning he knew she would one day find. When Harris arrived the next morning, Emily showed him the journal. He studied the entries carefully, his brow furrowed. "These notes suggest he had already been threatened," he said. He knew he was in danger, but kept documenting anyway. That explains why the film ended up hidden instead of destroyed. Someone knew it was too risky to leave it with him. Emily thought of the storage locker where the canister was discovered. The randomness of its location no longer felt accidental. Someone had placed it there deliberately, far enough away to avoid suspicion, yet not destroyed. Perhaps they had feared destroying it would only draw more attention if the negatives ever surfaced. The detective closed the journal gently, his expression grim. "This isn't just about your brother anymore. Whatever he uncovered in 1995 is still out there, and someone has been keeping it buried. These symbols are part of a network, a language meant for those who already know how to read it. Daniel was trying to crack it." "Oh?" Emily sat back, the weight of her brother's unfinished work pressing down on her. He had left her not only photographs but words, breadcrumbs leading her deeper into the same shadows he had followed. And now she knew his story was far from over. Emily drove back to Daniel's apartment building, a place she had avoided for years. The paint on the stairwell walls was peeling, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, but stepping into his old unit was like stepping into a time capsule. The landlord had left it untouched after her brother disappeared, a courtesy to the family that had once seemed unbearable. Now it felt like a chance to hear his voice again. Dust motes drifted through the slats of the blinds, settling over the furniture like a thin veil of silence. She walked slowly through the space, her hand brushing over the shelves where Daniel kept his cameras, the negatives stacked neatly in envelopes, and the photographs he never sold. It was clear he had been working on something private, something he hadn't intended to share yet. On his desk, Emily found a small locked drawer she didn't remember. The lock had rusted over the years, but with a screwdriver she pried it open. Inside was a bundle of envelopes tied with string. She sat down in the quiet room and carefully untied them. Inside were contact sheets, much like the ones from the festival, but these were from earlier trips Daniel had taken across different towns. Each sheet revealed the same faint symbol scratched or painted into doorways, fences, or alley walls. The repetition was startling. He had been following these marks for years, quietly assembling proof that they were connected. Beneath the photos was a folded map with small X's marked in red ink. Each location corresponded to a photograph where the symbol appeared. Emily realized with a shiver that her brother had been building a trail long before the night he vanished. Harris arrived soon after she called him, and when she spread the map across the desk, his jaw tightened. "This wasn't an accident," he said. "Daniel was tracking them. He knew something about this group and thought he could expose it." Emily stared at the X's on the map, her eyes drawn to the one circled in bold near their hometown festival grounds. She knew Daniel had walked straight into danger that night, but what haunted her most was the possibility that he had known exactly what he was risking. He had followed the trail anyway, determined to capture the truth, even if it cost him his life. The map stayed spread across Daniel's desk long into the night, Emily tracing the red X's with her fingertip, as if by doing so she could retrace his final steps. Each mark represented a town where he had worked, places she remembered him visiting with nothing more than his camera and a restless determination. To her, they had been harmless trips. To him, they had been part of a much larger pursuit. The overlapping triangles weren't isolated graffiti, they were connected, forming a chain that stretched farther than she wanted to imagine. Detective Harris leaned over the map, studying the ink with a practiced eye. "This isn't random," he said. "Look at the spacing. These locations are along old trade routes, highways that were heavily used in the 90s. If this symbol marks territory, it could mean the group Daniel was tracking moved through these corridors regularly." Emily thought of the photographs of the man in the hat, always at the edge of Daniel's frame, always watching. If these routes were still active in some form, then the man in the hat might not just be a shadow from the past. He could still be out there, guarding whatever secret Daniel had uncovered. Harris suggested contacting a retired officer who had worked missing persons in the mid-90s, someone who might remember similar patterns. Emily agreed, though unease settled over her. Every step forward felt like pulling a thread that could unravel more than she was prepared for. Yet she couldn't stop now. The film, the journals, and the photographs were all guiding her, as if Daniel himself were urging her to finish what he started. She gathered the envelopes in the map, tucking them carefully into a folder. The silence of the apartment pressed down on her, and she found herself standing at the window, staring out at the same view her brother must have seen countless nights before he disappeared. The streetlights cast long shadows, and for a fleeting moment she imagined him still there, camera in hand, determined and unafraid. When she finally turned off the lights and locked the door behind her, Emily knew she had crossed a line. She was no longer just his sister searching for closure. She had stepped directly into Daniel's unfinished work, and the same shadows that had swallowed him were beginning to stir around her. Emily and Harris drove out to meet the retired officer the following afternoon, the folder of Daniel's photographs resting in Emily's lap. The man's name was Roy Callahan, and he lived on the edge of town in a weathered farmhouse surrounded by fields that had long gone to seed. His reputation had been one of persistence, a detective who often dug too deep into cases others preferred to leave unsolved. Roy greeted them at the door with cautious eyes, but when Harris mentioned Daniel's disappearance, his expression softened. He ushered them inside to a living room filled with the smell of old tobacco and dust, walls lined with boxes of files he had kept after retirement. Emily spread Daniel's photographs across the coffee table, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. Roy leaned over them, his hand pausing on the faint carvings of the overlapping triangles. A long silence stretched before he finally spoke. "I've seen these before." He disappeared into the back room and returned with a folder thick with reports. Inside were photographs from the early 90s, graffiti on warehouse doors, carvings on fence posts, chalk marks on alley walls. Each one bore the same symbol Daniel had captured. "We suspected it was tied to a smuggling ring," Roy explained. "Drugs, sometimes weapons. They used the marks as signals for drop points. We could never prove it, and every time we got close, the investigation was shut down." Emily felt her stomach twist. Daniel hadn't been chasing shadows. He had walked straight into the path of something organized and dangerous. "If he was following these marks," she asked quietly, "what would that mean?" Roy's gaze moved to her, filled with both sympathy and warning. "It means he was getting close, too close, and somebody made sure he never finished." Harris pressed for names, but Roy shook his head. "Most of the men involved are either dead, locked up on other charges, or still hiding in plain sight. The symbol alone was enough to make people nervous. Your brother, he had guts. But guts only get you so far." Emily looked down at Daniel's photograph spread before her, the weight of Roy's words heavy in her chest. Her brother hadn't vanished because of chance. He had been silenced because he had found something worth hiding, and now she carried the fragments of that truth in her hands. Roy's words stayed with Emily long after they left the farmhouse. The drive back into town was quiet, the weight of confirmation settling heavily between her and Harris. Daniel hadn't vanished in some inexplicable twist of fate. He had uncovered something that others had spent years burying. For the first time, the mystery felt less like an open wound and more like a trail, one she was finally equipped to follow. That night, Emily spread the map across her kitchen table once again. The red X's Daniel had drawn stood out under the yellow light, each mark a place where the symbols had appeared. She followed the path with her eyes, noticing how it curved along old highways and eventually converged near a shuttered factory on the outskirts of town. The factory had closed its doors in the early 90s, its windows broken, its brick walls scarred with spray paint. Daniel had circled it twice on the map, pressing the pen so hard that the ink had bled through the paper. Harris arrived not long after, carrying files Roy had reluctantly shared. Inside were reports of unexplained activity near the same factory trucks arriving at night, lights flickering in buildings that were supposedly abandoned, men seen coming and going without names attached. The investigations had ended abruptly, stamped inconclusive. Emily felt her chest tighten as she stared at the photographs from Roy's folder. The same symbol, carved into a loading dock door at the factory, captured years before Daniel disappeared. "He was there," she whispered almost to herself. "He must have gone back the night of the festival." Harris nodded slowly. "If the meeting place was here, it explains why he was followed. The man in the hat wasn't random, he was a lookout. Daniel caught him in the frame because he was standing guard." The realization washed over Emily with a mix of fear and clarity. Her brother had not been lost by accident. He had been taken because he had seen too much. And the film, hidden away in a locker miles from here, was never meant to survive. She folded the map carefully, her resolve hardening. The factory still stood, even in ruins, and somewhere inside its hollow walls lay the answers Daniel had died to reveal. Emily and Harris drove out to the edge of town the next morning, where the abandoned factory loomed like a relic of another time. Its brick walls were weathered, vines creeping up the sides, and rusted sheets of metal clung precariously to broken windows. The air smelled faintly of damp concrete and old smoke, as if the building itself remembered the life it once held. Emily stood for a long moment at the chain-link fence, gripping the cold wire, imagining Daniel standing in this very spot 13 years earlier with his camera in hand. Harris cut the lock and pushed the gate open, the screech of metal echoing across the empty lot. Inside, the factory floor stretched out in shadows, shafts of sunlight spilling through holes in the roof and illuminating patches of cracked cement. Emily's footsteps echoed as she followed Harris deeper into the cavernous space, her heart pounding in rhythm with each step. They found the loading dock at the back, its heavy doors sagging on rusted hinges. On one panel, faint but still visible beneath layers of graffiti, was the same carved symbol. Emily reached out and touched it, her hand trembling. "He was here," she whispered. The thought sent a chill down her spine. Harris crouched near a pile of debris and sifted through the rubble. Among the broken wood and shards of glass, he pulled free a small metal key, tarnished with age. It was attached to a plastic tag with faded numbers, the kind used for storage lockers. He handed it to Emily, his expression grim. This could explain how the film ended up in that unit. Whoever brought it there may have used this key. Emily turned the tag over in her hand, her pulse racing. The locker number was barely legible, but it was a physical link tying the factory to the evidence that had surfaced 13 years later. She felt the weight of Daniel's presence pressing in, as if he were urging her not to stop here. The factory was silent, yet it seemed alive with echoes. Emily closed her hand around the key, her grief sharpening into determination. Daniel had left her a trail, and step by step, she was following him into the truth he had died to uncover. The key weighed heavily in Emily's palm as she and Harris left the factory behind. Its tag was worn nearly smooth, but the faint locker number still clung to the plastic like a secret unwilling to fade. They traced the number to a storage facility just outside town, a low row of corrugated metal doors standing in the shadow of the interstate. The manager, a balding man with cautious eyes, met them at the gate. When Harris flashed his badge, the man hesitated before leading them down the narrow lane between units. The number on Emily's tag matched a door at the far end, its lock hanging open as though waiting for them. The manager admitted the unit had been abandoned for years before being auctioned off, its contents scattered. Emily's chest tightened as she realized Daniel's final film roll had once sat inside this very room. She stepped through the threshold, the smell of dust and stale air thick in her throat. The floor was littered with scraps of cardboard, old newspapers curled at the edges, and a few broken crates. It looked empty, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had been deliberately left behind. Harris scanned the walls, running his hand across the corrugated metal until he paused at a section near the back. The surface rang hollow when he tapped it. With effort, he pried back the thin panel, revealing a narrow gap stuffed with a plastic bag. Inside were several envelopes, each sealed and brittle with age. He handed them carefully to Emily, whose fingers shook as she opened the first. Photographs slid out. Black and white prints of men standing near the factory loading dock. They were grainy, taken at night, but their faces were clear enough. One of them wore the wide-brimmed hat, his eyes glancing toward the camera with startling awareness. In another frame, a group of men gathered around crates, their expressions tense. Emily pressed a hand to her mouth, recognizing the same determination in these shots that had lived in Daniel's festival images. He had followed them here, documented what he saw, and hidden the evidence when he realized the danger closing in. For the first time, Emily felt closer to her brother than she had in years. His camera had not only captured the truth, it had kept speaking long after he was gone. Emily spread the photographs across the motel bed, the thin paper curling at the edges from years of concealment. Each image felt like a fragment of Daniel's final days, a story told in silence. She studied the men's faces, the way they clustered around the crates, their postures guarded yet purposeful. The man in the hat was there in nearly every frame, his shadow stretching across the concrete like a sentinel. It was no longer just a blurred figure at the edge of the crowd. Now, his features were clearer, sharper, though still unfamiliar. Harris leaned against the dresser, flipping through one of Roy Callahan's old reports. "These photos change everything," he said quietly. They prove Daniel wasn't just imagining danger, he was documenting a criminal operation. He tapped one of the prints with his finger. "This is evidence, even after all these years." Emily nodded, though her chest ached as she stared at the photographs. Her brother had known he was being hunted, yet he kept pressing the shutter, frame after frame, determined to leave behind proof. "He wanted us to see this," she murmured. "He wanted someone to finish what he started." One photograph caught her attention more than the others. In the corner, barely visible, a van was parked near the loading dock. The side bore a faded logo, the letters almost indecipherable but familiar enough to stir something in her memory. She leaned closer, her heart quickening. She remembered that same logo painted on delivery trucks that once moved through town in the 90s, a company that had closed abruptly not long after Daniel vanished. Harris noticed her expression. "You recognize it?" Emily pointed to the faint letters. "That company went bankrupt the year after Daniel disappeared. But what if it wasn't bankruptcy? What if it was a cover?" Harris's eyes narrowed as he made a note. "If we can trace the ownership, we might finally have names." Emily sat back, her hands trembling as she gathered the photos. For years she had lived with nothing but absence, but now she was holding pieces of Daniel's last pursuit, tangible proof of the danger he had uncovered. The man in the hat, the crates, the van with its fading logo, it was all there, a puzzle left waiting for her to solve. And for the first time, she believed she could. Emily could not stop staring at the faint logo on the van, its outline ghostly but persistent, like something clawing its way back from memory. Harris wasted no time, contacting an archivist at the county office who specialized in defunct businesses. Within hours, they had confirmation. The company was called Mason Freight, a regional delivery service that had collapsed in 1996 after a series of unexplained financial losses. On paper, it had simply folded under mismanagement, but buried in the old reports were whispers of missing shipments, discrepancies in manifests, and anonymous tips about trucks being used for cargo that never appeared on official invoices. Emily sat in silence as Harris read through the files. It was no coincidence. Daniel had captured Mason Freight trucks at the factory because they were part of the smuggling operation Roy Callahan had tried to uncover. The overlapping symbols, the late-night deliveries, the guarded men, it all pointed to a network that had used the company as a front. Harris slid one of the photographs toward her. "If your brother saw this, he must have known what it meant. And if Mason Freight folded right after he disappeared, maybe someone forced the shutdown to bury the trail." Emily traced the outline of the van in the photo, her chest tightening. She remembered Daniel once telling her that photography was about more than beauty. It was about capturing evidence that time could not erase. Even now, his camera was revealing truths that men had tried to smother under silence. That evening, Emily and Harris drove past the old Mason Freight lot. The yard was overgrown with weeds, the office windows shattered, a rusting sign leaning at an angle above the gate. She imagined Daniel standing there years ago, camera in hand, documenting the same scene under cloak of night. She could almost hear the click of his shutter, steady and unflinching, despite the danger. Emily gripped the folder of photos against her chest as they sat in the car, watching the ruins of the company that had once pulsed with hidden activity. Daniel's trail was no longer faint. It was pointing directly at the men who had silenced him. For the first time, Emily felt the possibility of justice within reach, carried forward on the very images her brother had risked everything to preserve. Emily returned home that night with the photographs spread across her kitchen table once again, the images of Mason Freight trucks staring back at her like silent witnesses. She hardly slept, her mind replaying the pieces of the puzzle Daniel had left behind. The symbol carved on posts, the man in the hat watching from the shadows, the circled factory on Daniel's map, and now the van bearing a company name that had vanished almost as quickly as her brother. Every detail threaded together, pointing to something larger and far darker than she had ever imagined when she first held his forgotten roll of film. By morning, Harris had tracked down an address belonging to the last registered owner of Mason Freight, a man named Richard Lyle. He lived 2 towns over, in a modest brick home on the edge of a cul-de-sac. The house looked unassuming, its yard trimmed neatly, the kind of place where children might play without ever suspecting the secrets behind its doors. Harris suggested they pay him a visit. Emily insisted on going too, her resolve unshaken. When Richard opened the door, the years showed plainly on his face, but his eyes were sharp, guarded. Harris introduced himself, flashing his badge, and asked about Mason Freight. Richard's expression stiffened, the easy pretense of small talk vanishing. "That company went under a long time ago," he said flatly. "I don't know what you expect me to tell you." Emily stepped forward before Harris could reply. She pulled one of Daniel's photographs from the folder, the one showing the van at the factory loading dock. "Then explain why this was taken in 1995, she said quietly, her voice steady. Richard froze. His gaze flickered to the image, and for the briefest moment, fear crossed his features before he masked it with indifference. He muttered something about old deliveries, about rumors that never amounted to anything, but Emily saw the truth in his hesitation. He recognized the scene, and worse, he recognized the photographer who had captured it. As they left, Harris leaned close and whispered, "He knows more than he's saying." Emily clutched the photograph tightly, her pulse quickening. For the first time since Daniel vanished, she was standing in front of someone who might have looked into the same lens her brother raised on that final night. Emily sat in the passenger seat of Harris's car, her fingers twisting around the edge of Daniel's photograph as they drove away from Richard Lyle's home. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the hum of the tires on the road. She couldn't stop thinking about the flicker of recognition in Lyle's eyes, the way his composure had cracked when he saw the image. Daniel had stood across from this man 13 years ago, his camera raised, capturing a piece of evidence that still had the power to rattle him. Harris finally spoke. "He's hiding something." That look wasn't confusion, it was memory. He drummed his fingers against the steering wheel, his mind already working through possibilities. "We can't push him yet without more evidence, but we know he's connected." Emily stared out the window at the blur of houses and storefronts passing by. She thought of Daniel, how he must have felt that night, realizing he was documenting something that could put him in danger. He had gone ahead anyway, trusting his camera to speak for him if he couldn't. She felt the weight of that trust now, pressing against her chest like a responsibility she couldn't ignore. When they returned to town, Harris arranged to have Lyle's name run through old records. The search revealed ties between Mason Freight and several shell companies, businesses that had dissolved quietly in the years following Daniel's disappearance. Money had been funneled through them, accounts closed swiftly, leaving little trace, but one name surfaced again and again in the paperwork, an associate listed on multiple documents, always on the periphery. The name was Edward Crane, a man with a reputation for staying out of photographs, a shadow in the background of other people's ventures. Harris leaned back in his chair, frowning as he explained. "If Lyle was the face of Mason Freight, Crane may have been the one pulling strings behind the scenes, and if your brother's pictures captured their operation, then Crane is the man we need to find." Emily felt a chill at the name. She didn't know him, but she could almost see him in her brother's final images, a presence behind the man in the hat, orchestrating it all. Daniel had uncovered their world, piece by piece, and now she stood on the edge of stepping directly into it. Emily couldn't shake the name Edward Crane from her thoughts. It echoed in her mind like a thread pulling everything together, a man who had never stood in front of Daniel's lens, but whose presence seemed to linger in the shadows of his photographs. Harris spent hours combing through old financial records and police reports, uncovering fragments of Crane's history. He was careful, deliberate, never listed as the direct owner of anything, but always appearing as an advisor, a consultant, a silent partner. He thrived in the periphery, which made Daniel's instinct to capture evidence all the more dangerous. That evening, Emily sat alone in her kitchen, Daniel's journal spread open to the pages where he had sketched the overlapping triangles. The The words seemed to speak louder now that she knew Crane's name. She could almost hear her brother's voice, telling her that the pattern was deliberate, that the danger was real. She wondered if Crane had been aware of Daniel from the very beginning, if the man in the hat had simply been a servant of his watchful eye. When Harris called, his tone was heavy. Crane was questioned once in the late 90s, he said. Not about Daniel, about another disappearance tied to smuggling routes. Nothing stuck, no charges filed. He walked away clean, like he always does. Emily pressed her hand against the cool surface of the table, her heart pounding. Daniel hadn't been chasing random symbols, he had been circling Crane's operation without even realizing how close he was to its center. And when Crane realized it too, Daniel's fate had been sealed. Later that night, she returned to her brother's apartment with the photos from the locker. She pinned them to the wall beside the map, each one a piece of the puzzle. The man in the hat at the edge of the crowd, the van with Mason Freight's fading logo, the crates by the factory doors. And behind it all, a name that had never shown his face, Edward Crane. As she stood back, staring at the web Daniel had begun, and she was now finishing, Emily felt a surge of determination. She would not let Crane remain a shadow. If Daniel had risked everything to leave her this trail, she would follow it, even if it meant stepping into the same darkness that had claimed him. The following morning, Emily met Harris at the station, where he laid out everything they had gathered so far. The photographs from the locker, Daniel's journals, Roy Callahan's old reports, and the financial trails pointing toward Edward Crane. Spread across the table, it looked less like fragments of a cold case and more like a map leading straight to the man who had orchestrated her brother's disappearance. Harris leaned forward, his voice low. If we're going to move on Crane, we need to be cautious. He's survived this long because he knows how to cover his tracks. Emily studied the photographs again, her eyes lingering on the man in the hat. He was never alone. In several frames, other men hovered nearby, their faces caught only partially by Daniel's lens. These weren't random associates, she said. They were working together. Crane had people on the ground, and Daniel captured more of them than he realized. Harris nodded. We'll run facial recognition, see if we can match them to old records. Even if Crane kept his distance, his men didn't. As the afternoon wore on, Emily left the station with copies of Daniel's photos tucked into her bag. She stopped at a cafe on her way home, staring at the images spread out across the table. Strangers glanced curiously, but quickly looked away, leaving her alone in the corner with the ghosts of Daniel's last night. She traced her brother's reflection in the storefront glass, his camera raised, the shadow of the hat behind him. For the first time, she felt she understood the weight he must have carried, the awareness that he was standing on the edge of something vast and dangerous. When Harris called later, his voice carried urgency. One of the men in Daniel's photographs matched a former Mason Freight driver. He disappeared in 1997 after testifying against a low-level smuggler. That ties the company, the factory, and Crane together more tightly than ever. Emily closed her eyes, her hand gripping the phone until her knuckles whitened. The pieces were finally locking into place. Daniel hadn't just stumbled into danger, he had uncovered the machinery of a network that had swallowed people whole and erased them without a trace. And now, with his photograph still speaking across 13 silent years, Emily knew the truth was no longer buried. It was rising to the surface, and Crane would not be able to hide forever. Emily drove through the quiet streets of her hometown late that night, Daniel's photographs resting in the seat beside her like fragile companions. She found herself drawn back to the old festival grounds, the place where her brother had taken his final pictures. The field was silent now, the wooden posts worn down by time, but as she stepped onto the grass, she could almost hear echoes of laughter and music drifting through the air. It was here that Daniel had noticed the man in the hat. It was here he had followed the trail that led him to the factory and ultimately to his disappearance. She set the photographs on the hood of her car, arranging them in sequence the way Daniel would have. The progression told a story. The lively crowd, the shadow on the edge, the carved symbols, the reflection in glass, and finally the night shots at the factory. She whispered into the quiet, "I see it now, Daniel. I see what you were telling me." For a moment she felt as though her brother was standing beside her, camera slung over his shoulder, urging her to keep going. The sound of a car approaching pulled her back to the present. Headlights swept across the field, and Harris's vehicle rolled to a stop. He stepped out holding a folder, his expression serious but resolute. "We've confirmed another identity," he said, handing her the documents. Inside was a grainy driver's license photo that matched one of the men near the crates in Daniel's images. The man had been a known associate of Edward Crane in the mid-90s. Emily felt a cold surge of clarity. So Daniel wasn't just circling the truth, he had it in his hands. Harris nodded. And that's why they couldn't let him walk away. They stood in the field together, the weight of Daniel's work pressing down on both of them. The photographs weren't just relics of the past, they were testimony, a record of something men had tried to erase. Emily gathered them carefully, sliding them back into their folder. She looked out at the shadows stretching across the festival grounds and whispered again, softer this time, "I won't let them silence you." For the first time since the film surfaced, she felt that Daniel's story was no longer just a memory. It was evidence, and she was its keeper. Emily sat in Harris's office the next morning, the folder of Daniel's photographs resting between them. The air felt charged, as if the case itself was beginning to breathe after years of suffocation. Harris had spread the images across his desk, marking connections with notes and red strings pinned to a board on the wall. The names Mason Freight, Richard Lyle, Edward Crane were circled in bold ink, each tied to faces that Daniel had unknowingly immortalized with his camera. Harris leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "We're close, but Crane won't be easy to touch. Men like him survive because they know how to stay invisible. We need something undeniable, something that puts him directly at the scene." Emily's eyes fell to one of Daniel's underexposed photographs, the one taken near the factory loading dock. She leaned closer, studying the background. Faint though it was, she saw what looked like a shadowy figure leaning out of the van, watching the exchange. The features were blurred, but the shape of the man's face and the cut of his suit made her heart race. "What if this is Crane?" she asked, her voice catching. Harris took the print to the forensic technician. After hours of digital enhancement, the faint outline sharpened. The angle was partial, the light uneven, but there was enough to compare against an old ID photo of Crane from the archives. The jawline, the build, even the tilt of his shoulders it matched. Harris looked at Emily, his eyes hard. "If this holds in court, it's the first photographic evidence tying Crane to the operation." Emily felt a wave of both triumph and grief. Daniel had captured him all along. Her brother had been closer to exposing Crane than anyone realized, and it had cost him his life. She pressed her hand against the print, her throat tight with emotion. "Daniel did this," she whispered. "He left us what we needed." For the first time in 13 years, the case was no longer about speculation. It was about proof. Crane's shadow had been dragged into the light by the very man he tried to silence. Emily knew then that her brother's final roll of film was more than evidence, it was his testimony, and it was speaking louder than ever. The trial that followed months later was grueling, but Emily attended every session, clutching Daniel's photographs like lifelines. The courtroom air was thick with tension as prosecutors unveiled the prints, each one displayed on a screen for the jury to see. The faces of the men at the factory, the crates being unloaded, the Mason freight van, and finally the blurred but unmistakable outline of Edward Crane leaning into the shadows. The images spoke with a clarity that no testimony could match. They were fragments of truth Daniel had risked everything to capture, and now, at last, they were being heard. Crane sat at the defense table, his composure unshaken, but Emily noticed how he avoided looking at the photographs. For years, he had lived in the margins, untouchable. But here he was confronted by evidence he could not erase. Harris testified. Roy Callahan provided context from his abandoned investigation, and experts confirmed the authenticity of the film. Piece by piece, the silence around Daniel's disappearance cracked. Emily found herself staring at the jury during closing arguments, wondering if they could feel Daniel's presence as she did, woven into every image. When the verdict came, guilty on multiple counts tied to trafficking and conspiracy, a rush of relief surged through her. It did not bring Daniel back, but it gave weight to his sacrifice. Crane would spend the rest of his life behind bars, and the network he had protected for so long had been dragged into daylight. After the trial, Emily returned to the old festival grounds one last time. She stood where Daniel had raised his camera, the field quiet, and still beneath the late summer sky. She unfolded one of his photographs and held it against the fading light, whispering, "We finished it, Daniel. Your work lives." The grief was still there, sharp and unyielding, but it was tempered now with pride. Daniel had not vanished in vain. His camera had spoken across 13 years, bridging the silence, guiding her to the truth. Emily felt the wind move gently through the grass, almost like a reply, and for the first time she allowed herself to breathe. The story her brother had begun was complete, and justice, though long delayed, had finally arrived.